The congregation at First Light Baptist Church adored Pastor Jonathan Wells. To them, he was a beacon of faith, a devoted husband, and a father of 5 perfect children. His sermons filled the pews, his words lifted the weary, and his kindness reached even the lost souls wandering the streets. But on that scorching August afternoon, something inside Jonathan Wells cracked. It was supposed to be a routine doctor's visit for his youngest son, Matthew. A simple allergy test had led to an unexpected suggestion from the pediatrician: genetic testing. When the results arrived, Jonathan nearly collapsed. The DNA analysis revealed something impossible. Matthew was not his biological child. His wife, Rebecca, had never given him a reason to doubt her fidelity. But the test was conclusive. Confused and desperate for an answer, Jonathan secretly ordered tests for his 4 other children. The results came in a week later. Every single one of them, David, Sarah, Emily, Joshua, and Matthew, shared a biological father. And that father was not him. The name on the report sent shivers down his spine. It was his own father, Benjamin Wells. Jonathan couldn't breathe. His father had been dead for 3 years, but the betrayal felt fresh, raw. The man who raised him, taught him about faith and righteousness, had secretly fathered his entire family. How? When? Why? His mind reeled with fragmented memories. Rebecca and Benjamin laughing at a family barbecue. His father's long hugs whenever he visited. The times he had arrived home from church only to find his father there before him. Had she loved him? Or had she been forced? That night, Jonathan sat across from Rebecca at the dinner table, their children laughing in the background, completely unaware of the storm brewing in their father's soul. "You look pale," Rebecca said, reaching for his hand. Jonathan pulled away. "I got some test results back." Her expression faltered. "What test results?" He slid the envelope across the table. Rebecca hesitated before picking it up, unfolding the paper with shaking hands. As her eyes skimmed the text, the blood drained from her face. "John, I can explain." "No," he snapped, his voice trembling with fury. "You cannot explain this." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "It wasn't what you think." Jonathan stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. The children turned toward the sudden noise, confusion on their faces. He stormed upstairs, locking himself in their bedroom. He could hear Rebecca trying to calm the children, pretending everything was normal. But nothing would ever be normal again. Jonathan didn't go to church that morning. He couldn't stand before his congregation and preach about forgiveness while his blood boiled with rage. Rebecca tried to speak to him, but he refused to look at her. By evening, he was drowning in whiskey, something he hadn't touched since his youth. As he sat in the dimly lit kitchen, a thought crept into his mind. A solution. A way to cleanse the sin, the shame, the unbearable truth. His hands curled into fists. Rebecca had to die. The Wells house was quiet that night. The children had gone to bed. Rebecca had cried herself to sleep, exhausted from Jonathan's silent treatment. Jonathan sat at the foot of the bed, staring at her sleeping form. How could she have done this to him? How could she have let his father defile their marriage, their children? His fingers tightened around the handle of the hammer he had retrieved from the garage. He whispered a final prayer before raising his arm. A metallic scent hung in the air. The hammer felt heavier now, slick with the blood of the woman he once loved. Rebecca's body lay sprawled across their bed, her skull caved in from the repeated blows. Her once bright blue eyes, the same eyes that had gazed at him with love for over 15 years, were now frozen in shock. A faint, gurgling sound had escaped her lips after the first strike, but she hadn't screamed. Maybe she had known it was coming. Jonathan stood over her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He expected to feel something: guilt, relief, horror, but all he felt was emptiness. He turned away, gripping the edge of the dresser as his body trembled. His mind raced. The children. They were still asleep. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the rhythmic ticking of the bedside clock. They couldn't see this. Jonathan forced himself to move, stepping into the master bathroom to wash Rebecca's blood from his hands. He avoided the mirror. He didn't want to see the man staring back at him. He had to clean up. Jonathan worked mechanically, as if he were preparing for Sunday service instead of covering up a murder. He wrapped Rebecca's body in their white bed sheet, tying it tightly with the same rope he used to secure Christmas decorations in the garage. Her lifeless form was lighter than he expected. He hoisted her over his shoulder and carried her down the stairs, careful not to wake the children. The garage door creaked as he opened it, the sound sending a chill down his spine. He placed her in the trunk of his car and stared at her for a long moment. This wasn't over. Not yet. Jonathan drove in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The sun had just begun to rise, casting an eerie orange glow over Jacksonville's empty streets. He took the back roads, avoiding main highways and security cameras. He knew exactly where he was going. The dense, swampy area near the St. John's River, where no one would find her. He parked deep in the woods, pulling Rebecca's body from the trunk. The morning air was thick with humidity, making it harder to breathe. Using a hunting knife from his toolbox, he set to work. It wasn't easy, but it had to be done. He dismembered her, piece by piece, wrapping each part in garbage bags before tossing them into different parts of the river. The gators would take care of the rest. When it was over, Jonathan stood at the water's edge, staring at the murky ripples. The evidence was gone. The woman who had betrayed him was gone. He took a deep breath and turned back toward his car. It was time to go home. By the time the children woke up, breakfast was already on the table. Jonathan greeted them with a smile, just like any other morning. "Where's Mom?" Emily asked, rubbing her tired eyes. Jonathan sipped his coffee. She had to leave early. Church business. The lie slipped from his lips so easily it scared him. He packed their lunches, kissed them on their foreheads, and dropped them off at school. Everything was normal. No one would ever know. Or so he thought. 2 days passed without a single call from Rebecca's phone. Jonathan told friends and church members that she had gone on a spiritual retreat, needing time to reflect. People believed him at first, but by Sunday morning, whispers started circulating. Rebecca never missed church. She never went anywhere without telling at least one of her friends. After service, Deacon Richard Pulaski pulled Jonathan aside. "Pastor, have you heard from Rebecca? We're all worried." Jonathan forced a tight smile. "She's fine, just needed time away." Richard nodded but didn't seem convinced. That night, Rebecca's sister Diane called. "John, where's my sister?" Her voice was sharp, accusing. Jonathan tightened his grip on the phone. "She needed space, Diane." "Bullshit." Diane's voice cracked. "If you don't call the police, I will." Jonathan hung up. His heart pounded. Diane would never stop digging, and soon neither would the cops. Detective Samuel Grayson had seen his fair share of missing persons cases. Some were runaways, some were people looking for a fresh start. Others, the truly concerning ones, weren't missing at all. They were dead. When Rebecca Wells' sister Diane stormed into the precinct that Monday morning, Grayson could already tell this was one of those cases. "She's gone," Diane insisted, her voice shaking with anger. "Jonathan's lying. I know it." Grayson leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You said your sister went missing 5 days ago?" "Yes." "And no one else has reported it?" Diane slammed her hands on the desk. "Because everyone believes him. He's a pastor. He tells them she needed space, and they just accept it." Grayson made a few notes. "Has Rebecca ever disappeared before?" "Never. Not without telling me." Diane's voice broke. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Grayson sighed. Gut feelings weren't evidence, but experience told him they shouldn't be ignored either. "All right," he said. "Let's take a look." Grayson and his partner, Detective Maria Lopez, arrived at the Wells home just after lunch. It was a neat, well-kept house in an upper-middle-class neighborhood. White picket fence, a garden out front, an American flag fluttering in the warm Florida breeze. Jonathan answered the door, his face the perfect picture of surprise and concern. "Officers," he greeted them. "Is something wrong?" Grayson flipped open his notebook. "Mr. Wells, we're here about your wife. Her sister filed a missing persons report." Jonathan blinked. "That's ridiculous. Rebecca's fine. Where is she?" "She's on a retreat. She needed time away." Lopez glanced around the house. "Did she take her phone?" "She must have." "Credit cards?" Jonathan hesitated. I don't know." Lopez exchanged a look with Grayson. "You don't know?" Jonathan forced a smile. She left in a hurry. I didn't check her things. Grayson tapped his pen against his notepad. Mind if we come in? Jonathan hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, but Grayson caught it. Of course, Jonathan said, stepping aside. The house was spotless. Too spotless. No dishes in the sink, no laundry, no sign of a woman who had packed and left suddenly. We'd like to take a look at her belongings, Lopez said. Jonathan tensed. Why? Routine, Grayson said smoothly. Just to confirm she left on her own. Jonathan forced another smile. Of course. Upstairs, Rebecca's closet was untouched, full. Her shoes were neatly lined up. Her makeup sat untouched on the vanity. Lopez crouched, checking under the bed. Suitcase is here. She turned to Jonathan. What exactly did she take? Jonathan's throat bobbed. I don't know. Grayson's gut tightened. He's lying. But they had nothing to hold him on. Not yet. We'll be in touch, Grayson said as they left. Jonathan closed the door behind them, his hands shaking. He had cleaned everything. There was no evidence. But the cops were watching now, and that was a problem. Grayson and Lopez ran Rebecca's financial records. No activity, no hotel check-ins, no credit card use, nothing. People who go on retreats still buy gas, Lopez muttered, scrolling through the database. Or food, Grayson added. They checked traffic cameras. No sign of Rebecca's car. By noon, a patrol unit found it parked at a Walmart lot. Abandoned. The driver's seat was too far back for someone Rebecca's height. The car was wiped clean, but they'd still run forensics. It was the first real crack in Jonathan's story. Grayson smiled grimly. They were getting closer. By midweek, the congregation at First Light Baptist Church was in an uproar. Rebecca was still missing. Diane was making noise. And now the police were asking questions. Jonathan felt the walls closing in. That night, he sat in his study staring at his father's old Bible. If only he hadn't ordered those DNA tests. If only he had never known. He ran his hands through his hair. The cops were going to find something. And when they did, everything would fall apart. Detective Grayson leaned over his desk, staring at the open case file. Something about Jonathan Wells' story didn't sit right. A woman doesn't just vanish without a trace, especially not a pastor's wife. Lopez walked in, tossing a folder onto the desk. Forensics came back on Rebecca's car. Grayson flipped it open. Tell me something good. Lopez sighed. No prints, no blood, nothing. It was wiped clean. Grayson rubbed his temples. He's careful, yeah, but not careful enough, Lopez said, pointing to the last page of the report. Trace amounts of mud on the gas pedal and driver's seat. Lab says it's from St. John's River area. And get this, security footage from Walmart shows Jonathan parking the car and walking away. Grayson's eyes darkened. So much for her leaving on her own. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to push harder. Grayson and Lopez spent the morning canvassing the Wells neighborhood. Most people gave the same story. Rebecca was a kind woman, always at church, always helping others. No one had seen or heard from her in a week. Then they knocked on the neighbor's door. Mrs. Halloway, an elderly widow with sharp eyes, peered out. About time y'all came around. Lopez raised an eyebrow. You saw something? She nodded. Wednesday night last week. I was up late. Couldn't sleep. I saw Pastor Wells carrying something heavy out to his car. Looked like a rolled-up rug or something. He was sweating real bad. Grayson's pulse quickened. You sure it was Wednesday? Positive. The Price is Right had just gone off. Lopez jotted it down. Did you see where he went? No, but he was gone for hours. As they walked back to the car, Lopez muttered, That old lady just gave us probable cause. Grayson nodded. Time to turn up the heat. Jonathan Wells sat across from them in the dimly lit interview room, his hands folded neatly on the table. He still carried the air of a pastor, but there was tension in his jaw. Grayson dropped the file in front of him. We found your wife's car. You want to explain why security footage shows you parking it? Jonathan's fingers twitched. I was just moving it. She called me, said she was leaving, asked me to drop it somewhere safe. Grayson tilted his head. Really? Because her phone hasn't made a call in a week. Jonathan swallowed. Lopez leaned in. Your neighbor saw you carrying something heavy to your car the night Rebecca went missing. Want to tell us what it was? Jonathan's breath hitched. A bag of old clothes. I was donating them. Grayson slammed a photo onto the table. A still from the Walmart footage. Jonathan walking away from the car, looking over his shoulder. That doesn't look like a man helping his wife, Grayson said. Silence. Jonathan clenched his fists. I need a lawyer. Grayson smirked. Smart choice. But in his gut, he knew they had him. Now they just had to prove it. With the evidence mounting, Grayson got a warrant to search the St. John's River area. By noon, a cadaver dog caught a scent near the bank. And then they found it. A garbage bag torn open by the current, revealing something inside. Something pale. A severed hand. The officers stared in grim silence. Lopez exhaled. We got him. Grayson looked toward the horizon. Jonathan Wells' perfect life was over. The precinct was buzzing. The discovery at St. John's River had turned the missing persons case into a full-blown homicide investigation. The forensic team was still analyzing the remains, but Grayson knew they belonged to Rebecca Wells. The press had already caught wind of the case, and whispers of the pastor's wife murder were spreading. Lopez dropped a fresh stack of reports on Grayson's desk. You're going to want to see this. He picked up the top document, a DNA analysis. What am I looking at? Lopez took a deep breath. Rebecca's severed hand had traces of her own blood, and get this, Jonathan's DNA under the fingernails. She fought back. Grayson leaned back in his chair. That means we can put him at the scene of the crime. Lopez nodded. And there's more. The search team found something buried near the river. Burnt documents. Grayson frowned. What kind of documents? Lopez handed him a clear evidence bag containing a half-charred piece of paper. Grayson squinted at the visible text. It was a DNA test result. Then he saw the names. Jonathan Wells' children, Nathan Wells, Jacob Wells, Sarah Wells, Michael Wells, Emily Wells. Paternal match, Daniel Wells, Jonathan's father. Grayson's stomach dropped. Oh, hell! Jonathan's own father had fathered all 5 of his children. No wonder Rebecca was dead. Jonathan sat in the interrogation room, hands cuffed, his face pale. His lawyer, a stiff-looking man in a navy suit, sat beside him, whispering in his ear. Grayson and Lopez entered, placing the evidence files on the table. We found your wife, Jonathan, Grayson said, watching for a reaction, or what's left of her. Jonathan flinched but said nothing. Lopez slid the DNA results across the table. We also found this. Jonathan's jaw clenched. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Grayson leaned forward. You want to tell us how you felt when you opened that envelope? When you found out your father had been sleeping with your wife? That every single one of your children was actually your half-sibling? Jonathan's breathing turned shallow. His fingers twitched. You killed her, didn't you? Lopez pressed. She confronted you, told you the truth, and you snapped. Jonathan's lawyer held up a hand. My client has no comment. Grayson smirked. That's fine. You don't have to talk. The evidence is talking for you. He placed a final photo on the table, the severed hand, covered in bite marks. Jonathan's face turned ghostly white. For the first time, he whispered, She lied to me. Grayson's eyes narrowed. So you cut her into pieces? Jonathan Wells stared at the floor and said nothing. But they had enough. By the end of the day, he was charged with first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. Later that night, Grayson paid a visit to Daniel Wells, the father at the center of it all. The old man sat on his porch, sipping whiskey, his face emotionless. You destroyed your son's life, Grayson said, taking a seat across from him. Daniel smirked. He destroyed his own life. You knew, didn't you, that those kids weren't his? Daniel took another sip. I always said Jonathan wasn't man enough to handle the truth. Grayson studied him. This wasn't a grieving father. This was a man who had played a long, twisted game, and it had ended in blood. Detective Grayson sat at his desk, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. The case was nearly wrapped, but something still gnawed at him. The way Daniel Wells had spoken, cold, calculated, made him question whether Jonathan had acted alone. Lopez walked in, holding a fresh report. Autopsy confirmed what we suspected. Rebecca was strangled before she was dismembered. And get this, she had defensive wounds on her arms and a fractured wrist. She fought like hell, Grayson muttered. Lopez nodded. Also, forensic analysis of the garbage bags showed multiple sets of fingerprints. Jonathan's, but also someone else's. Grayson sat up. Who? Lopez sighed. Still running it through the system, but the partial prints don't match Rebecca or Jonathan. Grayson's gut tightened. Was there another killer? Jonathan Wells was brought back in for questioning, his lawyer at his side. Grayson placed crime scene photos in front of him. The severed hand, the defensive wounds, the DNA results. Your father knew, didn't he? Grayson asked. That's why you snapped. The man you trusted most had been sleeping with your wife for years, and when Rebecca finally told you the truth, you lost control. Jonathan's hands trembled. He swallowed hard, but his lawyer cut in. No more questions. My client is prepared to make a plea deal. Manslaughter. Grayson scoffed. You think this was manslaughter? She was strangled, chopped into pieces, and dumped like trash. Jonathan clenched his jaw. I didn't. His voice cracked. Lopez leaned forward. Then who helped you? Jonathan's eyes darted to the table. I can't. Grayson knew that look. Jonathan was terrified, and it could only mean one thing. His father was involved. That night, Lopez rushed into Grayson's office holding a file. We got a match on the second set of prints. Grayson took the paper and exhaled sharply. Daniel Wells. The fingerprints on the garbage bags were his. Grayson grabbed his keys. Let's go get him. They found Daniel Wells at home, sitting in his recliner, sipping whiskey like he had no care in the world. You gonna tell me what this is about, detective? He asked as Grayson and Lopez entered. Grayson didn't play games. We found your fingerprints at the dump site, Daniel chuckled, swirling his drink. I wondered when you'd figure it out. Lopez pulled out his cuffs. Daniel Wells, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, and accessory after the fact. Daniel smirked but didn't resist. That boy of mine never could clean up his own mess. As they let him out, Grayson felt a wave of satisfaction. Jonathan had snapped, but Daniel had helped cover it up. Now they would both pay. Back at the station, Grayson watched through the interrogation glass as Jonathan and Daniel sat in separate rooms, their lives shattered. Lopez leaned in. You ever seen a case like this? Grayson exhaled. A preacher killing his wife after learning his father was the real father of his kids? Number, and I hope I never do again. But deep down, he knew. There were always more secrets waiting to be uncovered. The weight of the case hung heavy in the air. Detective Grayson sat in the dimly lit office, watching the interrogation footage of Jonathan and Daniel Wells. Two men, father and son, destroyed by secrets, betrayal, and murder. Lopez walked in, tossing a file on the desk. Prosecutors are moving fast. They're charging Jonathan with first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Daniel's getting accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. Grayson nodded. They deserve worse. Lopez sat down. Jonathan's lawyer called. He wants to cut a deal. Grayson sighed. He wasn't surprised. The evidence was stacked against him, and Jonathan knew it. Let's hear him out, Grayson said. Jonathan Wells sat across from them in the interrogation room, his once pristine preacher's demeanor replaced by a hollow, broken man. His lawyer sat beside him, silent. Grayson leaned forward. You want to talk? Jonathan swallowed hard, then nodded. His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to kill her. Grayson let the silence stretch. He knew Jonathan was ready to break. She came to me that night, Jonathan continued, his fingers trembling. Told me the truth. Said she had taken a DNA test. That none of our kids were mine. That my father, his voice cracked. That my father had been with her for years. His eyes filled with tears, but Grayson felt no sympathy. I snapped, Jonathan admitted. I screamed at her, accused her of lying, but she showed me the papers. And I lost it. He clenched his fists. I grabbed her. I just wanted her to take it back, to say it wasn't true. But she fought me, scratched me, and then... He exhaled shakily. I strangled her. The room was silent. Jonathan closed his eyes. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I called my father. Grayson's jaw tightened. And he helped you cover it up. Jonathan nodded. He told me to get rid of the body. Said he'd take care of the car and the DNA test. He told me this was Rebecca's fault, that she should have kept it a secret. Lopez scoffed. So he convinced you to cut her up and dump her like trash? Jonathan let out a hollow laugh. He made me believe I had no other choice. Grayson sat back, disgusted. You always had a choice. Jonathan Wells would spend the rest of his life in prison, and his father would rot in a cell beside him. A week after Rebecca's remains were found, the case was formally closed. Jonathan and Daniel Wells were denied bail. Rebecca's children, Jonathan's half-siblings, were placed in protective custody. The media had turned the case into a national scandal. The headlines were relentless. But for Grayson, it was just another case, another reminder of how dark people could be. As he packed up the files, Lopez clapped him on the back. Drinks tonight? Grayson smirked. Yeah, I need something strong after this one. Lopez chuckled. You and me both. Outside, the sun was setting over Jacksonville, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. Another case closed. Another monster locked away. But Grayson knew there would always be another.